Hello, everybody. Welcome once again to the Harm Reduction Report. You're listening to Sandbagger News Radio on KEQQ. I am your humble host, Willard TeaBelly. And from the Sandbagger Newsroom today in Colorado, I wish you G-Funkers a fond hello. How you doing? I hear it's cold. Real cold. I called my dad the other day. Yesterday, he said it was 15 below at noon, and that it was going to be low of minus 35 in coming nights, and that there was a storm approaching for the weekend. So, a nice harm reduction welcome hello to all my friends and family and everyone back home in G-Funk. Hope you're doing all right. It's not so bad here in Fort Collins. It's sunny every day, pretty much, and I just went on a hike yesterday. There's like some snow on the ground, but it's not very cold. It was super windy yesterday, but, could be worse. As anytime I do find myself complaining about the cold, I think about what my daddy always says. At this time, he'd say something like, well, it is winter. And I can't blame him for that. It sure is. A couple weeks ago on the Harm Reduction Report, we outlined the entire history of this radio program. I walked through the last 42 episodes that we have so far produced, and we discussed, what was it we were really covering, and we thought about what direction we would be taking. And so last week I shared that thing about my grad project, and I suppose that's interesting. If anyone's interested, it'll be a fun way I'll return to that topic in coming weeks. Just maybe not. I'll try to do it more exciting. I listened to last time. It seemed a little boring to me, but hey, if you enjoyed it, great. Today's episode is not something I had in mind. It is turning to a new direction and covering this harm reduction stuff in an interesting way, but it was not something that I had outlined in our list of potential ideas, because this is one of those things that you can't predict at all. Someone really close to me died this week. My dear friend Larry, who we've spoken about a lot on the Harm Reduction Report, actually. Larry himself was never a guest, but especially when we were telling stories about how the Psychedelic Club and the UND Students for Sensible Drug Policy chapter were founded at the University of North Dakota while Larry and I were students there. Larry was completely vital for the process of that happening. Without Larry, I never would have connected with Frank White, who ended up being our faculty advisor to support the Students for Sensible Drug Policy chapter Psychedelic Club. Larry taught me some of the very first things I ever learned about harm reduction. And Larry, gosh, I mean, it was just really hard to hear that Larry died, and the whole tragedy is he'd been having these seizures, some pretty epic seizures recently, and he was on medication for them, but all signs so far basically seem to indicate that a seizure killed him while he was doing his homework in bed last week. It was just a couple weeks after I saw him last, and I hadn't seen him in probably more than a year until that, but right before New Year's this year, just 3 weeks ago, I saw him. He drove me from his place in Minneapolis to the airport when I was headed back here to school, and he was so brave. I remember thinking he was just so brave because, I've discussed those seizure-esque episodes that I've had on the show if you remember that. And, I described my fear at that time where I was thinking this might actually be a problem, a bigger problem. And Larry, he was so strong. I don't mean to tell you any gory details here, but earlier, the thing that he survived, that he's so strong, that made me know he was so strong, was he had a seizure a year or so ago in which he broke both of his arms, actually, while he was just sitting there doing homework with his roommate. And that's intense, but he recovered, and he was so brave, and he put up with a lot, and he was telling me not to worry about my problem. And, I never had to go on medication or anything, but we were each going through the whole MRI, EEG exams, neurologist meetings at the same time. And he seemed stronger than I, and he always gave me courage. And he still does give me courage to get through the scary times in my own head, as they may come here and there. But so I want to talk about Larry for probably the remainder of the episode here. Really, I'd like to start by reading an article he wrote in the student newspaper. So let me tell you how I met Larry. When I transferred to UND as a sophomore, coming from my first year of college in California, I applied to work at the student newspaper, the Dakota Student. And when I went in there for my interview, there sat Carrie and Larry, who were the editors at the student newspaper. And they interviewed me and hired me to be a section editor with them. And I had a good feeling about it from the very beginning. And my whole time at UND working at the student newspaper was just excellent. By the start of my junior year, I was editor of the paper, and Larry was managing editor. We were the number one and two people in command over there at the student newspaper, and it was awesome. It was the golden years of my college experience for sure. It was the paper stuff, and a lot of it had to do with Larry, because he was such a good presence. And twice a week, all of the editors would meet and spend a late night working in the basement editorial office after everyone else had gone home and gone to bed, working to put out the paper. And I was editor-in-chief for 100 issues over 2 years. And Larry was right there the whole time. And it was the best of times. And part of what made it the best of times was because this relationship and this position, like, we had opportunity to make a difference. That was something wild that we realized was a thing. And one thing I'd sort of realized was you can't just write an article in the student newspaper and expect a difference to be made. But you can write to certain people, right, at certain times, at certain moments, and for certain reasons you can share the link with later, and you can make an interesting difference. But the article of Larry and I wrote it together on April 16th, 2015. This article was the very first time where I experienced a blatant, difference making happened from something we wrote that had never before happened. I'll tell you what happened after I read it, just because that was sort of the chronology of how it happened. But at the time, spring semester 2015, Larry and I doing the paper stuff with our other friends, I was learning about harm reduction. And this was, I was in the room with Alex Davis's friends when they got the call that he had died. And that's sort of the focus of this article here I'll read. But it was that event that triggered us to talk, and Larry taught me about the things that we ended up writing this article about. So this article is mostly Larry here, but it's a combined experience of us, and I just want to read it, and maybe we'll go from there. But Larry titled it, "Putting Education Above Fear." The friends of UND student Alex Davis were doing homework, chatting about sea lions, and listening to music when they got the news he had died. Alex hadn't shown up to work that morning, and his friend was called in to cover his shift. Shortly after, they read the email that UND President Robert Kelly informing the campus of Alex's death. This article is in response to the email composed by the University Police Department that, quote, warned the campus community about dangerous synthetic designer drugs, end quote. Though this email was sent with the best of intentions, its advice will not save any lives at UND. If our goal as a community is to make people feel safe, we are going about it the wrong way. Telling people to abstain from drug use is in many ways similar to telling people to abstain from premarital sex. It's not inherently a bad idea, and it exhibits all the right intentions, but it's unrealistic to think it's the best way to keep people safe. That's why we teach students about safe sex and provide students with free condoms. Drugs should be treated in a similar manner. The fact is, people always have and always will use drugs, regardless of what state and federal laws are implemented or how serious the penalties for being caught with them are. Very little attention is given to safe drug use. But isn't that what we really want? Harm reduction, drug education, could include an honest communication of the risks posed by different substances, because what's entirely unappreciated to many in the community is that not all drugs are the same. Some, like NBOME, mentioned in UPD's email, are far more dangerous than others, like LSD, which was regarded as relatively safe physically. Quote, due to the nature of the way they are being obtained, users cannot be certain of what substances they're actually ingesting, end quote. The UPD email reads. This, as the department recognizes, is the most serious problem of campus drug use. As the trade of drugs online increases, drugs are often not sold as what they truly are, but rather as a similar drug whose effects they may mimic. NBOME is often sold as LSD, since NBOME is considerably cheaper and therefore has a higher profit margin if sold as LSD. Making test kits available to students would allow them to verify the substance they plan on using is what they think it is. These kits are cheap, and if the goal of universities is to reduce harm and save lives, it may be the most responsible, effective move. While there are legitimate worries that doing so would be seen as promoting drug use, it's far more likely to save a life than simply telling people to say no to drugs, period. Quote, we are certain that the instances we know about are only the tip of the iceberg, the UPD email reads. Is this supposed to sound intimidating or put more pressure of persecution on students who use drugs? Could it instead be an opportunity to teach people about these things? How much more safe will campus be if, as UPD's email recommends, we, quote, keep our eyes open for such things as small pieces of tinfoil and baggies and unusual behavior, and report unusual behavior to the police, end quote. It seems criminalizing students who might experiment with drugs is more important than making sure those who choose to are safe. If that's the university's goal, then it's being achieved. If we're really interested in keeping people safe, there is a better way. Oh, wow. Yeah. I remember that. That was pretty exciting for us at the time. So after we published that article, something happened, which happens every time we publish an article, which is basically nothing. Nothing happened. Typical sort of response. Putting something in the student newspaper. It's not like everyone suddenly changes and, considers what you said. But in this case, it happened. I was, the day or so after that was published, I was called into the Dean of Students office sort of for an unrelated kind of random reason. She needed my help with something, and I was like, I'm just about to leave when the Dean of Students, Kara Hallgren said, will you wait a second and will you tell me more about this thing I read in the student newspaper? Now, I was amazed that anyone had read something in the student newspaper and also chose to say, hey, I read this and I want to talk to you about it. Although, to be fair, it was Kara's job at the time to read the student newspaper and make sure that there aren't things happening she should know about. But anywho, she appreciated reading the paper, and it was very kind of her to stop and ask me about that article. And I explained to her what I had just been really learning about from Larry and others about substance testing kits, which we mentioned in the article. Things that allow someone to test their substances to make sure they're not contaminated with adulterated substances. For example, if you are trying to use an opiate like heroin and you want to make sure it's not contaminated with fentanyl, you can use substance testing kits and fentanyl testing strips and other harm reduction tools like that to test your stuff to make sure it's not contaminated. And there were the Psychedelic Club of the University of Boulder at the time had been taking data. They had been basically checking out these substance testing kits to students to use and return to them and also report their results. And I'm not sure how many, what their sample size was here on their respond rate for this, but they had said that of the people who used their testing kits that they had made available for a while, something like 80% of people didn't have what they thought they had. The ones who thought they had MDMA, 80% of them actually, it was contaminated with something, probably like methamphetamine. And it was 40%, I believe, of the people who thought they had LSD actually had NBOME, which is what's killed some UND students and other people around here. And though Kara never necessarily adopted the idea of the university paying for a bunch of these substance testing kits and making them available in the student union, even though that is exactly the case at other universities around the world. That, here that's seen as a little too risque or whatnot, right? There's a stigma against that kind of thing. So we just don't talk about drug use. So you can't do anything that openly supports people, even just in a simple harm reduction sense, who use drugs, quotes, drugs. But that conversation we started that day about that article led to a great relationship I had with Kara, and it turned into that whole saga about the university accepting our stuff. I wrote that whole essay for the Voices of the Valley a couple years ago called All Are Welcome to Change. And that basically told the story of how when we first started as a student organization, the UND Psychedelic Club, at the very last minute, it seemed as if they pulled our ability to be a group. We missed the deadline at the last minute because they said we needed to revise our mission statement because it sounded like we were promoting drug use, which we had thought we made pretty clear that we weren't doing because we had Frank White advising us to make sure we didn't come across that way. But anyway, as soon as we realized we couldn't be a group the following semester because we didn't get our organizational forms done in time because of this last minute revision they required, it was actually sort of a miscommunication. They would have allowed us to submit it again later, but it wasn't communicated to us very well. And we were under the impression they were just about to censor us, just prevent us from being a group, even though there's other chapters of this on other universities all around the country and the world. So it sounded a little weird. But when we finally got to talk to Kara Hallgren, and this story and this meeting here helped me in that process of eventually talking to her about our group and everything, she worked very closely with us and made sure that it was clear from her side that we weren't being censored and that they were being quite supportive, even though we were dealing with a subject that's, stigmatic. I mean, based on the rules of the university, as is legislated to them by the state, there can be a student group about anything so long as it isn't blatantly inciting violence or something. And so that's why it's a good thing that we weren't censored and that Kara would never do that to us. And that was a great relationship. And so I just have to thank Larry for making that whole relationship happen, because that started because of this article that he encouraged us to write together. There's a few more Larry articles I want to read. One right now details the coolest thing Larry and I ever did together at the paper. Coolest in terms of just like we had complete control of a situation, and like we did well, Well, here's the silly thing that happened. One day we found out that a resolution, well, I'll explain in the article sort of, but the day before there was a resolution to cut the student newspaper's funding made in the student senate at UND. We were informed. And they had done, the two freshmen who were proposing this thing had like done all this really strange undercover research, interrogating people at our staff without ever telling us what they like wanted this information about our budget for, and being really shady and weird and kind of intimidating and creepy. Suddenly proposed this surprise resolution to cut our funding. So Larry and I spent the night just reading their proposal, and we were planning to show up at the meeting, which normally, as a student newspaper office, we sit and listen to the meeting and report on it that night, because it happens to be the same night as we make a paper as when they have their meetings. Anywho, that night we were going to be up in the meeting, participating while taking notes. And we'll read the article and then I'll fill in the story if there's anything else I need to mention. But this was a real good one. It's the DS View on communication. It's called Communication. And Larry and I, this was the thing we were all about. We spent our whole college career, our whole relationship together, trying to communicate sincerely and figure out how we should define sincerity in that way. And this whole episode turned into a wonderful learning opportunity. And as I remember, this article describes it pretty well. It's been a while since I've read it. This is the DS View on Communication, published on March 3rd, 2015. This week, a resolution was proposed to Student Senate that would cut funding to the Dakota Student. Though we didn't learn of this resolution's existence until the night before it was heard, we spoke at the meeting and cleared the air. The resolution was withdrawn after we had a chance to open up the floor to discussion. Below is a coarse summary of what happened. Of the many claims made by the resolution, we have space here to address two of them. First is the resolution's claim that students whose opinions differ from those of the Dakota Student staff are being silenced. First of all, we at the Dakota Student do not all hold the same political beliefs by any means. If you don't believe us, our meetings are open to the public and anybody has the right to attend. By doing so, you will see that we are not in the business of telling fellow UND students how to think. One of the reasons this claim was included in the resolution is because one of the authors submitted a letter to the editor that did not get published. It was not withheld due to its political perspective. We do not hold any letter to the editor based on whatever political or religious perspective it supports, since, frankly, it makes absolutely no difference to us. We do not evaluate ourselves as journalists based on how many columns in the opinion section get printed that align with our own ideals. The author's letter was withheld for not meeting the Society of Professional Journalists' Code of Ethics, to which the Dakota Student adheres, by failing to minimize harm in its message. We do not have to tolerate letters that treat fellow students with disrespect. Additionally, There have been letters to the editor from all sorts of political ideologies that we have held for doing so. Another claim of the resolution is that the Dakota Student does not express a fair representation of the university. While we don't necessarily blame anyone for not reading the footnotes under our contact information on page 2, it explicitly states that opinions in this publication are not necessarily those of UND or the administration, faculty, staff, or student body of UND. We hire the writers who apply, and those are the people whose opinions are being published in the paper. If you have a problem with the opinion being expressed in the paper, be the change that you want to see in it, and please apply. We have not and never will turn away an applicant because of their personal beliefs. This may come as a surprise to the authors of the resolution, but there are plenty of times that we disagree entirely with the opinions being expressed by our opinion writers. Nobody would be more happy to see a greater diversity of opinions in the opinion section than us. There have been advertisements in every single issue in the opinion section this year seeking new writers. If you don't want to work for the Dakota Student, you are more than welcome to submit a letter to the editor. But again, we are not obligated to publish it and will not publish it if it is disrespectful to fellow UND students. The fact of the matter is, we would be more than happy to sit down with any UND student or staff member to discuss how we can work together to make the newspaper better. We've done this before, and every time, both parties have left happier than they were coming in. The authors want the university to have a student news source that represents the student body to the best of its ability. This is also our goal. Removing student fees from the Dakota Student budget would not help us get better. We're glad student government heard us out and that it was open communication that put everyone at ease. It usually does. This makes me want to jump to the end of another article Larry wrote called Free Speech. I'll just cut to the last couple paragraphs here where it sort of touches on that whole idea of we'll publish something, but not if it's disrespectful. Well, what if, being disrespectful is part of my free speech? What does free speech allow me to be exactly if not disrespectful? Well, here's something else Larry wrote in an article he wrote by himself. This is just the end of it about free speech. Here he says, freedom of speech does not mean freedom from the consequences of your speech. However, the widespread response to both of these recent events suggests that many people want to live in a society that allows and supports free speech more than they want to live in a society that is too afraid to speak its mind for fear of retaliation. In my opinion, this is the right stance to take. Free speech is absolutely essential in any democratic society, and without it, there can be no progress. Although an average buddy comedy and an edgy magazine cartoon may not seem like they are worth human lives, like anything, it is much more important to see the big picture. I'll just cut in for a little context there. In the article, he was talking about the buddy comedy being the movie The Interview, comparing that with the edgy magazine cartoon of Charlie Hebdo, which had the mass shooting there at that French newspaper office. So he's referencing, but then he ends his free speech article by saying, if we give in to threats and let fear dictate our actions and words, it only sends the message that violence is an effective means of accomplishing a certain goal and opens the door to anyone willing to use violence to accomplish their goals. Nice. Thanks, Larry. Well, there wasn't violence being proposed in our example of the budget being threatened to be cut. It was fear to threaten to cut our budget to get them to somehow change our ways. The problem was these two freshmen, I keep calling them that, like as if that excuses everything they did, but it sort of does speak to like why they did this. They had nothing behind their resolution, basically. As soon as they asked us in person, though they never took the time to ask us during all their weird undercover investigation. If they would have just asked us, we would have told them right away what they wanted to know, but they presented it in front of everyone, so we answered their questions in front of everyone, and they just immediately seemed super foolish and withdrew the thing right away. But it was so great because Larry and I just got to go up there. Like, we'd planned this out, and although like we knew that Student Senate really would not just cut our budget randomly because of this, it still just like gave us a chance to be there and be like riled up a little bit just because like they were threatening to cut our money, and like I was depending on that job and like, for my life at the time. And I mean, it was a serious thing sort of, but yeah, it turned out to be a cool thing we did together. The day we defended the student. We took a picture together, I think, and we called it the day we defended the student. And it's that story. I still tell that whole story in job interviews and stuff. I always talk about Larry when they ask something like, when's a time where you really did something sweet and you overcame like a sudden obstacle? It's like, well, how about the surprise, like find out someone's trying to cut your budget and like having to go there and justify yourself and to do so in a really sincere way and to have communication be the thing that is the love at the end that won the day for us, beautiful, wonderful. So it's a nice story and turned into a whole good thing. So thank you to those freshmen who made this happen. There's another story, and it continues on from Larry's explanation of free speech. And this is an article we wrote called Rights together, a DSVU called Rights. So Larry and I took a trip to Canada, and we went to the Human Rights Museum in Winnipeg, as the article will say. It's a beautiful place, and it was a fun road trip for he and I. We just had some time to kill on a weekend, basically, and made it happen. And wrote this trip about our trip to the Human Rights Museum. Is this brand new? Well, it's not brand new anymore, I guess, at least 5 years old. But a huge, cool building in Winnipeg. Great. I've been there lots of times, and it's always wonderful. So check it out. This is the article we wrote on February 5th, 2015. The DSVU on Rights. I figured you'd be able to see far from the Tower of Hope. But who knew it was in Manitoba? Last weekend, we went to the brand new Canadian Museum for Human Rights in Winnipeg, and it was seriously cool. The journey through the museum starts at the bottom of an architectural labyrinth of winding ramps, twisting staircases, and dizzying works of art. Exhibits on each floor use different combinations of visual art, music, text, and interactive screens to present their arguments about the history of genocide and human rights in Canada and throughout the world. Having grown up near the border, you'd think I'd know more about the history of our northern neighbors, but I realized a few minutes in that there was much I had never considered. In many ways, Canada went through the same horrific things America did in the last couple hundred years, and in many more, they are miles ahead of our society's version of inclusion and equality. Like the United States, for instance, the Canadian government and its early settlers went through the same patterns of abuse against the native peoples of the area. Reading the text of the Indigenous Perspectives exhibits, printed in both English and French, as were the other exhibits, felt like a trip through the same old stories of broken promises and disregarded human decency we've heard about U.S. treatment of Native Americans. Another exhibit explained how the Canadians, like the Americans, interned Japanese citizens in prison camps during World War II. Behind glass, I saw the suitcase and cooking utensils of a young Japanese man born and raised in Canada who was suddenly deemed an enemy alien by his country and forced to register himself as such and leave the continent. I still haven't decided if I was more disturbed by the patterns of history like these that have repeated themselves in different times and places, or the problems I hadn't heard of before. The most sobering of these I learned about is the massive ongoing crisis of violence, murder, and abduction of Indigenous women in sex trafficking systems. If you're interested to learn about how insane that problem is, check out Vice News for a really great news film on the subject. Elsewhere in the museum, I learned about the good things Canada is up to in regards to human rights, that the rest of the world could benefit from paying attention to. On top of that list is the fact that Canada became the 4th country in the world to legalize same-sex marriage 10 years ago. An awesome display featuring images of same-sex Canadian couples at their weddings was one of the few exhibits at the museum that didn't leave me feeling ashamed to be a human being. At the top of the massive building stands the Tower of Hope, an obelisk jutting an additional 24 meters above the city that provides a spectacular view of Winnipeg and the surrounding countryside. From here, we saw the horizon for what it is, a circle, where what looks like two things are really one. I'm not sure how hopeful I felt for humanity after trekking through the bowels of the Museum for Human Rights, but there certainly isn't a better way to end the experience there than with the stark reminder of our unity visible from that height. Larry taught me a lot about unity and like a sort of spiritual cosmic sense of unity, a really sincere sense of unity, and I think that lended to his goofiness and his easygoingness and his flowiness, his ability to flow, to flow as so. He also taught me about mandalas, and I just here found the article he wrote about mandalas, and I mean, to talk about flow. I don't know if you know what mandalas are, but he'll describe it here. This really did represent Larry quite well. Even though he's like going to law school and doing all this intense stuff, he was the flowiest bro. he could go with the flow. He was a good flow person. And he taught me about mandalas in this article he wrote himself, March 13th, 2015, called Mandalas. Among Tibetan Buddhists, there is a very interesting tradition that recently captured my curiosity: the creation and destruction of sand mandalas. While it's hard to describe how intricate and beautiful a mandala is with words, Webster Dictionary defines them as geometric figures representing the universe in Hindu and Buddhist symbolism. The sand mandala is created with various colors of sand, all placed very slowly and precisely into pre-drawn geometric patterns that, as a whole, make up the complete mandala. Creating the sand mandala takes extreme patience and precision. However, despite how incredible a completed sand mandala looks, it's not the completed project that I find the most interesting. It's the fact that not long after their completion, they are ceremonially destroyed. This is the beauty of the mandala: its transience. The first time I saw this process, not in real time, was in the documentary Samsara on Netflix. But you can find videos of this fascinating process anywhere on the internet. Interestingly enough, if you have seen the latest season of House of Cards, it actually shows this process in one of the episodes. To me, watching this process raises an interesting question. Is it a waste of time to create for the sake of creating? On one hand, we could put our time to better use in a way that will benefit others. On the other hand, our ability to create things as elaborate as a work of art or a piece of music is an extraordinary trait that makes humans so fascinating. Personally, I think we should have no problem in creating things just for the sake of it, whether you're spending hours on Minecraft or writing a piece of music that may never be heard by anyone. Our ability as humans to envision things in our heads and then turn them into something real is a fascinating ability that should not be put to waste simply because it isn't going to produce anything or make lasting change in the world. We could all benefit from playing with sand every once in a while. Oh, Larry, what a silly ending. But wow, great. Yeah, mandalas are great. You look up a picture of them, but it's kind of funny because the point is, not to take a picture of one and to just enjoy it while it is. And yeah, it's amazing. All these beautiful colors, sands, they brush it into the center, into this gray, brown, mushy, nothing sand. Then they throw it up into the wind and it disappears. So you're not really encouraged to take a picture of it. Go ahead and look up a picture of one if you want. It's pretty cool. So I think that last story completely speaks to his flowiness. The transience that he finds so valuable is what allows him to be who he is. That's who Larry was. Part of that coming out in his transience. He wrote another view called Silence on October 4th, 2014. Here is Larry's article called Silence. It starts out with a quote. That's when you know you found somebody special. When you can just shut up for a minute and comfortably enjoy the silence. That's Mia Wallace from Pulp Fiction. Start out an article called Silence with a quote from Pulp Fiction. Nice, Larry. Classic Larry. Larry writes, though I've seen this classic Quentin Tarantino movie countless times, the above quote remains one of my favorites. To me and many others, I'm sure this quote also holds a bit of truth. All day, every day, we are constantly surrounded by noise, whether it's traffic, music, construction, or people gossiping around you in lecture hall. It seems as though moments of genuine silence can be hard to come by in the daily grind we call life. However, sometimes the constant noise is within our control. In the context of the movie, the silence comes when the characters played by Uma Thurman and John Travolta run out of things to say during a dinner conversation. Although it's somewhat ironic that the silence is broken by this quote, the character continues by saying that she doesn't understand why people feel the need to fill the day with meaningless conversation. While I certainly don't oppose the idea of small talk in general, I do agree with the idea that sometimes it's better to just enjoy the company of the person you are with rather than just filling the air with meaningless conversation. But this begs the question, what is meaningless conversation? This question brings to mind another famous quote by Eleanor Roosevelt. Although the original source of the quote is disputed, it has been attributed to her. Here it is. Great minds discuss ideas. Average minds discuss events. Small minds discuss people. While I don't necessarily buy this quote unconditionally, I do think it has a very valid point. Why do great minds discuss ideas? Probably because ideas can propel society forward and improve the world. Why do average minds discuss events? This one's a little harder to figure out, but my guess would be because doing so is neither beneficial nor detrimental to society. Why do small minds discuss people? Probably because discussing people accomplishes very little, which brings me back to my point about meaningless conversation. In my opinion, conversation is meaningless when all it accomplishes is talking about people, probably behind their back and in a questionable manner, without any purpose whatsoever. Although talking about people is very likely the most common form of meaningless conversation, I think that meaningless conversation can take many forms. Although great minds talk about ideas, that doesn't necessarily mean that all ideas need talking about. We have all had that one person in class who loves the sound of their own voice and always has to chime in with their opinion about some abstract idea. Does the fact that they are talking about an idea rather than a person make the conversation any more meaningful? If they are talking just because they feel a need to be heard, I would argue that it doesn't. Maybe when it comes down to it, is that if conversation accomplishes nothing and can go without being said, then it's meaningless, and we should instead just enjoy the silence. Perhaps I am proving my very point with this rant. Am I really accomplishing anything by talking about how meaningless conversation is, or my promotion of silence through meaningless conversation itself? At the end of the day, maybe all we should do is think more before we talk and really decide whether what we are saying is accomplishing anything. If something can go without being said, Sometimes it might be better to just enjoy the peace and quiet we all have so very little of as it is. Oh, that's beautiful, Larry. Awesome. And you see, that begins to really get into our whole quest to find a communicative style, to find a way of speaking sincerely. It first starts with listening. And of course, you can't listen if you're not being silent. I think I have time for 2 more Larry articles. This one, and there's one I want to end with here, but this one here goes right along with his flowiness. It's simply called Now, and it was published September 23rd, 2014 in the Dakota Student. Remember that the future version of now will be just like this, right now. When it comes to living in the now versus planning for the future, we get very mixed messages from different sources in society. Throughout our entire secondary education, we are constantly being berated with information on why we need to start preparing for college, what we have to do to prepare for college, how to apply to colleges, what colleges look for in an applicant, and so on. But none of this ends once we actually get to college. As soon as the honeymoon phase is over, you quickly realize everyone is already telling you what you should be thinking about and preparing for after college. Whether you plan on going to grad school, getting an internship, or starting a big boy job, you are expected to start thinking about what you want to do and planning for it before you have even completed your generals. On the other hand, we also are constantly being told we should live for the moment and enjoy life as it happens, rather than constantly worry about things that have yet to happen. This is a very popular theme in the media, particularly in mainstream movies and music. We all have seen a cheesy B movie about the stressed out college students who learns to let go for the night and enjoy the present. The music industry also loves to tell us to let go of all our inhibitions, sometimes genuinely encouraging us to live the moment, and other times just encouraging us to get drunk. So what is the best course of action? Should we live every day like it's our last? Or should we devote all our time and energy to some future goal? Personally, I don't think that either is a very good way to live. If you lived a life of pure hedonism and did whatever you wanted all the time without any concern for future consequences, sooner or later you would crash and burn and wonder why you never managed to amount to much. On the other hand, if we only ever did things that were in furtherance of some future goal, our lives would probably be the most unbearable, stressful nightmares ever. While it might sound like a total cliche, I think it's a sound course of action to balance out instant gratification and long-term success. Each day, we should do something enjoyable for us in the present and something else that might not be enjoyable at the time but will benefit us in the future. On both sides of the spectrum, neither has to be anything too extreme. Enjoying the present could be something as simple as watching a movie or going out with your friends. Working towards a feature could be something as simple as starting that research paper you have been putting off for weeks, or taking a look at some grad school applications if you plan on going down that road. Just keep in mind that that future version of the present you're worrying about will feel exactly like this. So don't put too much stock into it over what's happening right now. Oh, that's great, Larry. That's great. That's great. Larry knew how to live now, and he knew how to communicate it very well. And he taught me so much. There's one more about peace. I'll try to record this one and maybe squeeze in one more too. This one's Larry published on September 12th, 2014, the Dakota Student's called Peace. Earlier this week, I found myself having some deep thoughts about life at the time of day that any normal human being would, 2 a.m. Of course, during the day, our brains often refuse to perform even the most basic functions when we actually need them to. But lying in bed, waiting to fall asleep, can actually bring some insight into your life. I was doing a lot of thinking about a pretty abstract concept, happiness. What is happiness? Although there is no absolute answer to this question, I personally believe that happiness is a temporary state in which we are able to appreciate the situation that we're in. I don't think happiness is the permanent state that many people believe it to be. While some people may experience moments of happiness more frequently than others, nobody is in a permanent state of bliss. The phrase pursuit of happiness is one that gets thrown around a lot, but is happiness something that can really be reached? For example, many people think that wealth or fame will bring them happiness. But even the wealthiest people in the world have so many problems accompanying their wealth that there is no way that they could be in a permanent state of happiness. In fact, I don't think being in a permanent state of happiness would be an advantageous way to live. On the spectrum of human emotions, all our different emotions serve a different purpose. For example, while we may find stress unpleasant, it can also drive us to achieve our full potential. So if we can't ever reach a permanent state of happiness, then what should we strive for? Simply put, I say we should aim for peace and balance in our lives. Happiness is a temporary emotion that can come and go. Peace, however, is a state of being that can be much more easily achieved and maintained. In my opinion, a sense of peace and well-being can be achieved by finding a balance in our lives. This means balancing out our social lives and our obligations, our bodies and our minds, our work and our relaxation, and so on. Furthermore, from a state of peace and balance, I believe that happiness might be more obtainable. As I previously stated, I personally believe that happiness is a temporary state in which we are able to appreciate the situation that we're in. Perhaps from a state of peace, we are more able to appreciate the world around us and our current situation, rather than relying on the excitement of a lifestyle of excess to achieve happiness. Boom, Larry. Well said. Classic. Nailed it. I'm going to see if we have time for the last one, and this is the very last thing he and I ever wrote together. Our very last DS view summed up everything we tried to do, so we hoped, called Insincerity, published May 5th, 2015. To communicate with another is to learn from yourself. When you have one chance to say the right thing in the best way, what will it be? This is not only the question facing newspaper editors squinting at computer screens as the deadline to print approaches. It is what anyone could ask before typing an email, greeting a friend, or begging forgiveness, since, as the wise in the East have discovered, the subject of communication is really the same subject of life. There is a perspective that defines the self as undefinable, and communication, whether between two people or 2 billion, as the expression of a singular form. The idea doesn't truly say anything, but it does mean this. Every word you say is sacred. It's hard to know what to say when you realize that. It's even harder when you know the people listening are too. Or is it? As soon as we recognize ourselves in the other, we develop a respect for sincerity and grow to feel fearless. I just never imagined it would feel like this. I thought a fearless person had to see something dangerous, feel their heartbeats quicken, and choose to dive in headfirst anyway, to risk their legacies for a chance at recognition. But a truly fearless person does not consider a thing dangerous at all. Being afraid does not come to mind. It is with a similar instinct we find ourselves tending to speak sincerely and recoil from the uncomfortable pursuit of persuasion. There simply is no better way when you know the person listening to you is you too. To be sincere without trying to be gives one an advantage in communicating, because from the very beginning you've discovered something many have not: the ability to communicate sincerely. And this, to our surprise, has proven the most effective way to communicate. After all, how hard is it to be yourself? Trick question. But for many in our culture, saying what you truly mean isn't easier than saying what others expect of you, though far more often it's the much better thing to say. But to practice at being sincere is a lot like forcing yourself to be in love with someone. By telling ourselves we must do that which will only work if done voluntarily, we automatically have other interests at heart. The goal of retelling the most genuine story has fallen second to our obsession of pleasing ourselves. As light requires darkness to be understood, as shape is inseparable from form, and as white implies black, speaking goes with listening. And whether we speak or whether we listen is entirely up to us. But you can't have one without the other. And so we speak with the sincerity we owe ourselves. That is only part of the legacy that my dear homie friend, Larry Philbin, is leaving behind. I am honored to be his friend and to be in a situation where I get to share some of his words here for all you people. Larry loved Grand Forks, he loved UND, and he loved what we were doing, and he would appreciate anybody here who's listening, because he was here in the beginning that made us happen. So thank you to Larry, thank you to everyone, thank you to Noah, KEQQ, Cal, friends and Sandbagger and Hay Bellies everywhere. Good night. I love you. Sandbag on.